My Father is working. What he's driven, what he's just, it's this compulsion in his life. What's going on in him that produces these kinds of works, that's what's going on inside of me. All right, a little word from the word today. John chapter 5, verse 19. This is an older study, and this is going to be in our playlist on the word from word, and then also the word from the word, and then our Bible study series. And I love doing word studies because sometimes in our English translation, as good as it is, and there are many, you miss the background idea. And I want to give you just a quick word here. The context of John chapter 5 really is Jesus is in Jerusalem in ministry, there to celebrate, whatever feast this was. And he finds himself in fact, the Verse 1 says, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. So there's arguments on which one it is. That's not the point. The point is he finds himself by the pool of Bethesda, and it's just an area where a lot of lame, a lot of crippled, a lot of diseased individuals would go, and they had set their hopes on this pool. And, tradition would at that point tell them that an angel of the Lord would have descended into the water, and it would cause the spring to bubble up. And if you could get in before the angel got out and the bubbles ceased, you would get healed. But there's no evidence that ever took place. In fact, scholars say they gleaned it from a pagan tradition, and it was just, it's honestly a cruel kind of a setting. This idea that, God wanted to heal you, but the first one in gets it, and if you get in fast enough, kind of an idea. And it's sad the leaders of Israel never really, squelched that idea or what have you. But anyway, Jesus finds himself in this area. The Chosen, by the way, has got a really neat depiction of this. But what I love about it, Jesus comes in and he walks up to this guy, just no bones about it, says, take up your mat and walk, and he's healed. And it's tremendous. What I want to focus on is the conversation after the healing, when Jesus is jumped, so to speak, by the leaders of Israel. And in verse 16, just the details of what took place in the miracle are verses 1 through 15. Then you come into verse 16, and it says, so because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. And so Jesus responds, and he responds in verse 17, then he'll have more criticism, and then he'll respond again in verse 19. In verse 17 and 19, he's essentially saying the same thing, but I really want to focus with you on what he says in verse 19. He says, verse 17, my Father is always at his work, and to this very day I too am working. So he says, hey, my Father is over here doing his thing, and what he's doing, I'm doing the same thing. Hey, my Father is working and I'm working. And I love this word for work. In the original language, it's the verb ergazomai, and it's from the noun ergon. And it's the idea behind my Father is always at his work and I am working. It's not just like, go to work kind of a thing, or I'm just doing something. It's in our culture, I believe it would be expressed by the guy, for example, who's trying to make the varsity football team. And man, all year he hits the weights, he watches his diet, and his friends, his parents, people that are observing him as coaches, they say he's really working at it. That's the idea. So it's more than just working, it's drive, it's inside kind of a deal. My Father is always working and I too am working. There's no days off on this kind of a thing. That's what he's saying in verse 17. Well, they didn't get it and they get all bent out of shape about the whole Father language. So he repeats it and he says in verse 19, and I love this, listen to this verse. And this is out of the NIV, 84. He says, I tell you the truth, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Okay, I put a lot of emphasis on the doing and the does. That's because there's a couple different Greek terms. This is so good. There's a couple different Greek terms that John had available when he's writing this story. And under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he uses one in particular. Let me say something real quick. You hear some people, talk about, language that Jesus uses. In fact, my son was recently, he contacted me, and he's in his schooling process, and he was among some students, and one of them was trying to propose the idea that the red letters in our Bible, the words of Jesus, they're actually they're more significant than, say, the letters of even Paul, or, letters that were not spoken by Jesus. Like, these are the actual words of Jesus. Well, CJ called me and goes, that doesn't sound right, And I was like, no, not really. Jesus was certainly in this setting speaking in Aramaic to Jewish people. This is written down in Greek. And so what you have is John, at this point, 60 years later, maybe 50 at the earliest, looking back on that scene. And what he's communicating through, it's a different language. The emphasis is not like this is the exact word that Jesus used. It is under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. What was going on what was going on in the mind and heart of Jesus when he's trying to communicate why he did what he did in this scene. And John uses some specific language. So the language he uses is really significant, because there's a couple different words for do or does. That's how that, whatever Jesus says, whatever I do, my Father does. There's a couple different Greek words he could have used that we could have translated do or does. One would be the Greek word proso. And it's a great term. Proso describes something that's accomplished, something that's done. It can be good, it can be bad, whatever. But it really lends itself, that term describes just an action that's accomplished. And if proso was used, the translation would mean Jesus says, whatever my Father does, I do. In other words, if you want to know why I heal people on the Sabbath, well, that's what my dad does. You want to know why I go to church on Sunday? My dad does that. You want to know why I read this translation of the Bible? Yeah, my dad reads that one. It would be that kind of meaning. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. So John doesn't use proso. John uses poieo. And poieo is a term that we translate do or does, but it can be translated in a variety of different ways. In secular Greek, this term was used to describe how trees do fruit. Now, in our culture, we wouldn't say, in our language, we wouldn't use the word do to describe how trees do fruit. We'd be like, they just don't do fruit. This is not just an action, which is what Jesus is trying to say. Trees produce fruit. Trees bear fruit. In fact, we know the kind of a tree based off its fruit, or we can know the kind of a tree based off its fruit. In its due season, because of what's going on inside of the tree, it will produce a certain kind of fruit. That's the word poieo. Poieo is also used to describe how, artists paint, poets compose their statements or their verses. So it's more than just, clever rhyming for a poet. It's more than just a painting. There's something that's going on inside of, just like the poet and the painter, the tree, there's something going on inside of it that makes it produce what it does. That's the idea behind this word, poieo, specifically in this verse, especially in this verse. So when Jesus says, whatever I do, my Father does, and whatever my Father does, I do, what he's really saying, you guys, leaders of Israel, are jumping down my throat because I healed this guy on the Sabbath. And I told you, my Father is working. What he's driven, what he's just, it's this compulsion in his life. What's going on in him that produces these kinds of works, that's what's going on inside of me. They didn't get it. So he goes to verse 19 and he says, let me use some different language. Poieo, tree bearing fruit language. Whatever's going on inside of my Father that makes him produce what he produces, that's what's going on inside of me. So you want to know why I healed this man on the Sabbath? Well, I couldn't help it. What drives my Father drives me. What was going on inside of him goes on inside of me. how I feel. It's how my Father feels. And I walked into the temple and I saw this guy through the eyes of my dad, and I just couldn't help myself. That's this term. That's this word. When you get into the scriptures, it's more than just information. And you know this. Everyone knows this. It's more than just information that we're reading. There's depth being communicated, a depth that goes beyond just simply study. It's a depth that is revealed by the Holy Spirit. There's passion and intent behind the language, and especially in this passage, which is incredible. And this word is used throughout the scriptures several times by Jesus to communicate not just something that he does, but the intent of his heart. And it's also used to describe, when Jesus speaks to the disciples, how one day, not just things that they will do, but the things that are done come out of this attitude of the heart. John Wesley, obviously tremendous individual, changed the course of history back in the 1700s, wrote about heart holiness. And this is that kind of a term. We're compelled because of what's going on inside of us. I just don't go to church on Sunday. Why wouldn't I go to church on Sunday? I don't just not talk to my wife this way. How could I talk to her that way? There's something going on inside of me as a direct result of God living in my body that changes how I walk, changes how I talk, how I see, how I function, how I act. That's in this verse. Whatever my Father does, I do. Such a neat term. That's your word for the day. Let the Holy Spirit guide you, and drive is probably not the right term, but let what's bubbling up in his heart come out of your life. That's the deal.